Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for this opportunity to speak. I'd like to give credit to Dr. Milena Komarova and Michael Butazzoni, who helped me in the research behind this paper. And I noticed that sitting there about the purpose of the Knowledge Exchange seminar series is to encourage debate, and certainly a topic for debate is the border. And I want to begin perhaps by noting, contrary to the title of this paper, that this is about Brexit and the borders, and wanting to add even more complication, I guess, to this very knotty problem of what to do about UK-Ireland relations in the context of Brexit. Given that the most consistent mantra that we hear from Brexiteers is the need to increase border controls, it's something of an irony that one of the few clear points of agreement between government ministers on what a post-Brexit landscape might look like is that it should preserve an open or at least a flexible Irish border. On her first visit to Belfast as Prime Minister, May assured us that no one wants to see a return to the borders of the past on the island. However, on her previous visit to the region, just prior to the referendum, May claimed it would be impossible for UK-Ireland arrangements to remain unchanged post-Brexit. Of course, then she was speaking as a pro-Remain Home Secretary, and Leave campaigners would have put her claims down to scaremongering. Nonetheless, both British and Irish governments are having to face the fact that in a post-Brexit context, the UK-Ireland border, or UK-Ireland borders, become external borders of the European Union. Things will inevitably change. The matter of how to accommodate this change without stoking political sensitivities and creating major practical problems, such as have already been touched upon already, is an urgent concern. And notably, both governments only have a limited capacity to address these concerns on a bilateral basis. The news this week that the governments are working on agreeing the imposition of border controls at Irish entry points demonstrates the manipulation of what capacity they have in this regard, i.e. that's centred on the common travel area. The priority of ensuring freedom of movement between these islands, though notably not for non-EEA citizens or passengers, demonstrates a will to try and blend both of Prime Minister May's objectives, i.e. to increase border controls without reverting to a securitised land border. In this brief presentation, I will argue that the UK exit from the EU has implications for borders that go far beyond the 500-kilometre land border. The concept of border regimes is worth introducing here because it allows us to recognise the multi-layered complexity of this issue. It also poses opportunity as well as challenge in this regard, and I hope to touch on some of those. Secondly, I want to outline the notion of an elastic Brexit. You heard it here first. In terms of the potential stretch in border-related policies. And I will conclude with an outline, very briefly, of which border-related topics may offer some yield in relation to this, and which ones may fracture if pulled too far post-Brexit. So the land border across the island is but one representation of a border regime between the UK and Ireland. State borders are rarely non-traversable frontiers. Every border that exists requires a specific regime that controls or limits its crossing. It also affects the treatment of goods, services, etc., once they've come across that border. Border regimes imply inclusion and exclusion, but also a hierarchy of status and treatment within that jurisdiction. Permission for border crossing depends most straightforwardly on the territory of origin of goods or persons. More complicated border controls, which have already been speculated about, are in place when they require a judgment of the merits and benefits to be brought by allowing entry of that good or of that person. There are layers of concentric border regimes, establishing such hierarchies over different types of movement. These layers of concentric border regimes exist within these islands, regional, national, supranational, and they differ in what they permit and include, and they allow us to think in a more nuanced way about cross-border cooperation after Brexit. So a good way of outlining these border regimes is to consider four components of them, put very briefly here. So the first is that of governance. This is a manifestation of power within the jurisdiction of the border regime. It relates to laws and rights and regulations. It also relates to representation in institutions. Most straightforwardly, it relates to public administration. The second dimension is that of flows. So when we hear about the 4 freedoms that are upheld by European integration, they relate most directly to this concept of flows. What can cross the border freely? And in which times or in which cases are there restrictions? This relates to all sorts of types of flows. Capital and people are one, but also it's worth thinking about the flow of information across borders. Citizenship, of course, is a really valid point for Northern Ireland in particular. The citizenship regime that exists within a particular jurisdiction reflects a lot about priorities within the government institutions there. At a crude level, very crude, it's about them and us, who belongs and who doesn't, who's allowed in and who is not. If we think back about 10 years ago in the UK, there was a focus on citizenship ceremonies and the process of becoming a citizen. And this reflected what we thought people ought to know or to be able to subscribe to in order to become a British citizen. Nowadays, it's even more crude. It's about who we allow in the first place. That's what the border controls are all about. And finally, of course, there's a dimension of security. Again, this tends to come to the fore when people think about cross-border cooperation post-Brexit. What might a securitized border look like? But more broadly, security enacted within a border regime reflects policing of who comes in and who is not allowed in, but also what goes on within that particular jurisdiction. And the competencies of Border Force or Frontex reflect those security dimensions enacted within a jurisdiction. So in this case, of course, we're thinking about several layers of border regimes. First of all, let's not forget that the UK and Ireland are part of a common border regime, that of the European Union. As well as shared subscription to the acquis communautaire, we have common EU citizenship rights. We experience supranational governance in relation to many things. Again, that's already been touched on. Membership of the single market, of course, and EU funding programs. All these reflect the fact that the EU is a single border regime, of which the UK and Ireland are an integral part. Common EEC and EU membership, of course, also went a long way to improve bilateral relations between the two states. The second border regime is that of British-Irish, or most particularly this is reflected in the common travel area as already touched upon. Originally created in 1923 as a means of responding to the problematique of the Northern Ireland border and the potential disruption to movement of people around it and across it. The regime of the common travel area is what, of course, makes this area distinct from the Schengen zone. It places the UK, Ireland, and the Crown dependencies together in a border regime that sees a hierarchical treatment of British and Irish citizens in comparison to others. It's evolved considerably over the past 90 years. It's had blips in particular ways, for example, not allowing people from Northern Ireland to travel to Britain easily just after the Second World War, during and after the Second World War. But the fact that it was maintained at the same time as, say, the Anglo-Irish trade war was continuing on in the 1930s shows how it is possible to treat different types of flow differently. An obvious manifestation of different border regimes is, of course, the different border regimes of the two states, Ireland and the United Kingdom. A third one is that of the island of Ireland itself. It is useful to think about this as a border regime. It has particular manifestations of governance in the north-south institutions, working together to draw the civil service and executive, as well as parliamentary functions together, and enabling all-island cooperation in specific sectors. The all-island border regime has weighty symbolic importance. I don't need to spell that out, but is also grounded in the type of practice-focused territorial cooperation that the European Union does well, addressing common concerns that transcend state boundaries. Finally, in a slightly unusual way, it's worth thinking about the border regimes that exist within the United Kingdom itself. Again, different layers of governance in relation to devolved institutions, and it's worth remembering that different levels of devolution apply within the various parts of the United Kingdom. Flows, as has already been touched upon too, the particular economic environment of Northern Ireland means that its interests are quite distinct from other parts of the UK. This is a major concern. Security, again, that's quite an obvious particularity within the Northern Ireland border regime compared to elsewhere in the United Kingdom. And citizenship is an interesting one too, and I've just put this here to liven things up a bit. Here's a picture. So it's from the 2011 census results, which give us interesting results in relation to identity. And it's just worth bearing in mind that, of course, the 1998 agreement recognised the equal status of British and Irish citizenship within Northern Ireland, and a fifth of passport holders, or people eligible to hold passports in Northern Ireland, hold an Irish passport. This is a very important point. But when we think about potential bespoke arrangements for Northern Ireland, it's worth thinking about, well, could this be a possible Devo Max situation? The difference, of course, for Scotland, or one of the many differences, but one notable one, is that there's a very strong Scottish national identity, which contrasts greatly with Northern Ireland, where there's a very strong British and British-only identity. So although we talk about fuzziness of citizenship regimes within the Common Travel Area and even within Northern Ireland, this kind of places that challenge in quite stark terms. Even if there was going to be flexibility within the United Kingdom, so far momentum seems to be towards centralisation and away from devolving further powers. This issue is particularly acute for Northern Ireland, given that the ideology of Brexit, as is currently being espoused from Westminster, appears to be largely informed by a peculiarly English rather than a British nationalism per se, but that's an aside, really. What we saw, as we saw 20 years ago, just prior to the 1998 agreement, what happens north and south may, though, be limited or shaped by what happens east and west, depending on the comfort of unionism and nationalism in any change therein. Okay, speedily on now to elastic Brexit. This does touch very briefly on the idea of soft Brexit and hard Brexit. And what I'm trying to examine here, and David's going to do it in much more detail, but is this question of elasticity. What sort of stretch is there with any possible solution for Northern Ireland post-Brexit? And it's worth noting, again, all these things, governance flows, etc., all those have different forms, whether we're talking about a soft Brexit or a hard Brexit. What will enable such elasticity are things, again, beyond the scope of this presentation, but it includes the likelihood or otherwise of there being a common Northern Ireland position, espoused very clearly. The letter from the First Minister and Deputy First Minister was a clear step towards that. It also depends on whether the UK's house is in order in terms of the status of the devolved regions. Of course, it depends on the will of the European Union and negotiators on the EU side, and perhaps, too, it depends on lobbying. And again, that relates to some of the issues already raised about which issues are we prepared to see elasticity on. So to rush over these, basically, for soft Brexit, what does it mean in terms of governance? Strands 2 and strands 3 of the agreement, north, south, east, west, they can continue on, in fact, have a new role, a new significance in a soft Brexit situation. Flows, it's still possible to have access to the single market, albeit under certain conditions. Again, EU funding, cross-border cooperation, that can all be possible. Freedom of movement, if the EU gets its wish, then freedom of movement will also be preserved, and security, Northern Ireland can partake in Europol and even peace funding, etc. A hard Brexit, simply put, a hard Brexit would require more hard bargaining with the European Union, not least because it means that the type of almost off-the-shelf arrangements that may already exist with Norway and Switzerland, for example, could not apply in this case. The special status for the region of Northern Ireland regarding flows, for example, would depend on bargaining, and bargaining not not with the South, but with the European Union itself. Elastic Brexit, some possibilities. Professor Finnemore is going to outline these in much more detail. The key point to make here, though, is that an elastic solution will require adjustment of several border regimes. It's necessarily, of course, going to involve the Irish government in some regard. It's also going to involve negotiations within the United Kingdom. Within this, however, differentiation of the priorities of the various border regimes can come into play. So, for example, the border regime of the European Union concentrates very greatly on the matter of flows. The border regime of the island of Ireland concentrates greatly on governance, for example. And the border regime, British-Irish, really espouses the importance of citizenship. So within these border regimes, it's possible to pick out different focuses that can be means for opportunities for negotiation. Multi-level governance is an imaginative way to approach the conundrum opposed by Brexit to the various border regimes that affect Northern Ireland's position. Lessons from 20 years ago demonstrate, however, that negotiations around this and towards multi-level governance will not be negotiated merely on the basis of rational pragmatics or urgent interests. So to conclude, and I left this deliberately open when I wrote that slide last week, but I'm going to fill it a wee bit now. So I want to conclude by tentatively suggesting which border-related priorities have more elasticity than others, and I'm conscious of the expertise in the room, and maybe some of these will be debated a wee bit in the questions. So by yield, I mean that there is some opportunity for flexibility there. These issues can be manipulated and thought about in imaginative ways, such as Lee was suggesting. The big question for the yield matter, though, is that of if. If the British government is prepared to concede on X, Y, and Z, if the EU is prepared to concede, if there is some imagination, etc. The other end of this is the idea of fracture points, what simply is an issue that could splinter very easily if pulled too hard. So some things that I think there may well be some yield in as cross-border issues on the island of Ireland in particular, but also more broadly. That of crime. So Lee already mentioned that the issue of the fear about smuggling and black marketeering becoming more prevalent post-Brexit, and this has certainly been touched on by the First Minister and Deputy First Minister. And this then is seen as posing a potential threat to security. But more generally, the mechanics for cross-border cooperation in relation to tackling crime would be eroded but not devastated by departure from the European Union, because most simply, the PSNI and An Garda Síochána don't rely entirely on the European Union for cooperating in these areas. And there's differences in the way that the two police services relate to some of the requirements of European police cooperation and information sharing and the like. Another area in which there could be some yield is that of EU programmes, and I know this is a huge concern, particularly in the border region. If there's a willingness to partake in European territorial cooperation and negotiate some programmes there, such as happens with Switzerland and with other third countries, then there is a possibility that there may be some yield in that regard. Similarly with the EU funding, of course, doesn't relate just only to Northern Ireland. It affects the contributions being made by the British and Irish governments and the like. But if the UK buys in, if there's a willing support from the South and flexibility there, then there is the opportunity to maintain some of the good work being done through EU funding. The agri-food sector, this has been touched on, but there could be potential there for special arrangements, as Graham has mentioned, relating to the origin of goods and some particular arrangements around electronic tagging or whatever it might be. Fisheries, there's already monitoring that goes on around borders in that regard, and there could be just a sort of an increase in that area in terms of electronic monitoring. And British-Irish institutions, East-West institutions, they may continue. Their role would be different, but they could also continue. In terms of fracture points, Energy could be seen to be a fracture point, as has been written on elsewhere. Britain is a net importer of energy from the European Union. Ireland is a net importer of energy from Britain. Northern Ireland is a net importer of energy from Ireland, from the south. So the imposition of tariffs on this energy supply really could cause severe problems for north and south. It's not one that's going to be negotiable in many ways. North-South institutions, the problem of policy divergence is a big one. But more broadly, the wider context and logic for North-South cooperation has been undermined in some way. The European Union made it normal and legitimised it and gave it an urgency that being outside the EU would change. It would be harder and it would be more sensitive. Labour markets, again, there's a divergence here between what is required within Northern Ireland is seen as a priority, such as allowing unskilled labour in, and what is the rhetoric and mantra from Westminster. And so this may be an area that really will be very sensitive and difficult, but actually cannot be pushed too far. Finally, local authority cooperation. The civil society organisations and local authorities will struggle to replace EU programme funds and will struggle outside of that environment for very many reasons. It was the worst possible time for them to be suddenly put asunder by Brexit, and the implications for enabling or disenabling cooperation between local authorities are very severe. So to conclude, if analysis of border policies and border management strategies elsewhere in the world tell us anything, it is that whether a particular issue yields or fractures depends as much on political will and imagination, including the imagination of civil servants, as stark realities and hard facts. Thanks very much.